those who have not been here last week, we had a very important share last week, and we discussed material which I have never discussed in this group, and I really have never discussed in any group. And critically, it was about the idea of the relationship of tzaddikim, or very great people, and the rest of mankind. And we essentially laid down the idea, the important idea, that God uses the greatest of Jews so that He can preserve the world, so that the world can continue on its essential course without becoming subject to the demands of justice. Normally, the world itself, the entire world, reaches a certain crescendo, and there are different parts in human history when the world suddenly reaches a climax, and that climax is a sum total of evil deeds, and the attribute of justice suddenly claims that world and says, that world is mine. What does it mean that the attribute of justice claims the world? It means that the Satan, who is the representative of the attribute of justice, the Satan, who is a certain malach, goes to God and says, the world has consumed itself, and I have the right to demand from justice that it be annihilated. And we have discussed a while back why annihilation is the consequence of evil deeds. We won't go into that. Now, the Ribono Shel Olam listens to justice. Why? Because He made justice. The Ribono Shel Olam is not constrained by justice in an actual sense, but the Ribono Shel Olam created the world so that it would run on the basis of din, or justice. And He did that basically because He wanted man to achieve his own Olam Haba, do it by himself, perfect himself, create his own Olam Haba. And in allowing man to do that, the concept of justice materialized. There was no such thing as justice before God wanted man to have the opportunity to create his own eternal life. There was no such thing as justice before that. So by allowing man, by actually insisting that man create his own world, because really man insists to God that He wants to do it Himself, the Ribono Shel Olam creates justice, which means that I will now observe what you do, and I will compensate you depending on what you do. That's all justice is. Justice is nothing more than a creative process which is allowed to unfold and to produce certain consequences. That is the essence of justice. You are repaid what you do. So, God created justice because this was the midah, or the measure in which He wanted the world to obtain its future life. No, once you create justice, you're in big problems. You have a lot of problems. Why? Because once you create the possibility of what? Of creation, that a person can create his own destiny, well, you're giving him the chance to either go up or go down. He has free will. That's what free will is all about. God does not tamper with your free will. You are outside of all existence when it comes to free will, and free will is a function of yourself only, without any pressure from the outside, really. So, there are two possibilities, either up or down, good or bad, existence or non-existence. The Ribono Shel Olam therefore has the problem, kaviyachol, so to speak. What does He do when the world tends to destroy itself? Now, a long time ago we said, way back, that the ability of the world to destroy itself is against the will of God, because God created the world in order to give it eternal life, to give it an eternal destiny that goes on without time, without end, of an with a very perfect state. And that's the will of God. In a way, that will must be sustained, because the will of God is not just the will of God. The will of God is the demand of existence itself. Since God is the process of existence, His will is existence. Very different than your will and my will. We can will something and nothing happens, you see, or will something and something does happen. But when God wills, it is synonymous with existence. His will is the act of creation itself. That's why God, I always say this thing, it sounds funny, God is a true magician. What is a true magician? Well, just ask a 5-year-old child. A true magician is someone who can just simply go and just will say, I want, and instantly the thing's created. A true magician, someone who's truly magical, can go outside and say, I want a Porsche right in front of me right now, and he wills it and instantly it appears. That's real magic. And I'm not talking about supernatural forces, I'm talking about real magic. Creation through the act of will alone. And that's what the Baruch Shem is. He is a true and absolute magician. So therefore, if he wants the world to sustain itself, if he wants the world to merit a future life, that will must be achieved. Yet, how do you reconcile the will of God with the possibility that that will may be frustrated? And that was the origin of Aham Sayichud. That is the origin of compassion. You see, because it's something I said a long time ago, a year ago, and it's something that has to be repeated. There is no such thing as mercy. The truth is, mercy and compassion are really illusory terms. God does not have mercy in a real sense. We tend to think in those terms, but these are very, very poor translations of what these words are. God is not merciful, nor is God really compassionate. What God really is nothing more than a being who has a desire to do good. That's all. God is a maker. The Baruch Shem wants to see absolute good. That's what he wants to see. He wants to create another being who will sustain a state of tremendous ecstasy. In wanting to do absolute good and giving that being free will so that that being can acquire it on its own, God then gives the possibility for that absolute good not to appear. Because it's possible for that being, in this case the neshama or the person, to destroy himself by acting improperly with his free will. But it is the will of God, it is the desire of God, which is existence, that does not happen. Well, how do you reconcile these two contradictions? You see, the reconciliation is called compassion or mercy. That's all it really is. It's not that, well, I'm going to give you another chance and I feel sorry for you. That doesn't play. There's no such thing in God's world like this. Mercy is nothing more than the reconciliation between two opposing forces. The force of free will, hence the force of annihilation, and the will of God, which is the will for existence. The reconciliation of those two is what we call Rahmanis. And that's how the mechanisms work. We have discussed at length how this will of God, in terms of reconciliation, transpires. How does God save the world? And I'm not going to go into it fully, but God uses the greatest of the Jews, the Tzaddikim Gemurim, to accomplish this task. And we went into the basic fundamental principles of how he does that with the Tzaddikim. And of course, it has to do with our old concept called externalization, where the Baruch Shem simply extracts or externalizes the existential state in which you created. If you did good deeds, you will create an existential state which will go on forever. If you did bad deeds, you will create an existential state which will annihilate you, which will tend to put you into non-existence. What is non-existence? What is non-existence? Let me just deviate for a second and tell you that it is not possible for you to go into non-existence, really. Nobody here can simply go poof and become non-existent. It's not possible. There's nothing that you can do, really, to put yourself into a state of non-existence. So then you'll say to me, so what have I been talking about up till now? When I say that if you do evil deeds, you will go into non-existence. What am I talking about? Let me clarify for you how a person goes into non-existence. How does that work, really? How do you simply disappear, and where do you disappear to? You cannot go into a state of non-existence, because you cannot go into a state of existence. You have no more association to non-exist as you do to exist. Why? Because you are not true existence, you simply possess it as a property or as a characteristic. You possess it as a feature of your being, which is connected to your essence. That's what it is. You are not really existence. You are not identical to existence. You happen to exist. God allows you to exist because He allows you to participate in some kind of process called existence. That's why you exist. But you and the process are not identical. So if you and the process of existence are not identical, if you simply use it or participate in some kind of activity called existence, so how can you not exist? Only one way. If you no longer participate in that process called non-existence. That's the only real way. But you don't really go into a process, into a realm of non-existence. What happens is basically your individuality is simply swallowed up by the absolute existence of God. And that's what it is. If God is like a sun with light coming out of it, if you can use this metaphor, and it is only a metaphor, then the beam of light coming out and suddenly going on its own is the soul. But when that beam of light turns around and goes back, it is no longer a beam of light. It disappears. What? It's totally, completely, removed. Its individual existence is no longer there. And it simply becomes part of that incredible mass called the sun. That's in essence how you non-exist. What the Rebbeinu Shalom in essence does is swallow you up, so to speak. Oh, that's a very bad term. But in a certain sense, what happens is, your individuation, that which suddenly brought you outside of God and allowed you to be you as distinct from Him in whatever capacity you can be, that disappears. So you are no longer. So as far as you're concerned, you're gone. But that's not true non-existence, really. Because only God can relate to non-existence, because only God relates to existence. Only the Rebbeinu Shalom understands what it really means not to be. Because only the Rebbeinu Shalom understands what it means to be in the real sense. So therefore only He relates to these two, not you at all. So I'm just kind of going off on the side, because when we talk about annihilation, it sounds like a very frightening process. But it is a frightening process, because it is the cessation of yourself, you see. But not some kind of void called non-existence. Rather, what ceases is the sense of you, yourself. That's what ceases. In any case, this is what the Rebbeinu Shalom deals with. He has to deal with these two contingencies. The fact that you'll either destroy yourself, annihilate yourself, or that you will sustain that individuality forever. That's what's at stake. Either you remain you forever, or that you part of you is gone. That's what we're talking about. And the Rebbeinu Shalom insists on sustaining the essence of mankind. And for that He employs certain mechanisms. The central mechanism which He employs, which we have called a long time ago, and I haven't used this word in a long time, the Hanhagas Hayichud. Those are the activities which the Rebbeinu Shalom uses in which to reconcile the contingencies of free will, so that His will is not frustrated. That is the Hanhagas Hayichud. The essence of the Hanhagas Hayichud is essential objective. Hanhaga means behavior or guidance or conduct. Yichud means unity. So the Hanhagas Hayichud translated means the behavior of God's oneness, or the rule or the conduct of His oneness. What that really basically means is the way He uses to save the world. Because the essential objective of the Hanhagas Hayichud is kiyum. Kiyum means survival, sustenance, maintenance, stability. That's what the Hanhagas Hayichud is about. The other power that emanates from God, the Hanhagas HaMishpat, is only concerned with justice. When God created the neshama and said, I give you free will, do as you wish, the power that emanated from God to establish that possibility is called the Hanodus HaMishpat, or the attribute of justice, or the conduct, or the power of justice. And when the Baruch Shem says, I however want to reconcile your acts of free will with my desire for you to sustain yourself in eternity, that's called Hanodus HaYichud, Kiyum. How does the Baruch Shem sustain mankind, even though mankind has a constant tendency to destroy itself? Through the mechanism that we described last week, where the Baruch Shem uses tzaddikim to do that. Okay. We have had the last, I think, 4 to 6 shurim all on the concept of justice. We have spent a long time. We have gone into a lot of material about this. So I think it's ready for an overview. This is not a review. This is an overview. There is a difference. Okay? A review is simply the repetition of that which has occurred. Even though I never repeat myself in the same way, so as far as I'm concerned, I never really review. But, as a concession to some people who say that I do review, a review is essentially a repetition of that which is once said. An overview is nothing more than really an opportunity to see that which is once said from a holistic standpoint. So that suddenly, whereas you were all introduced to the specific elements of a picture, now you can see the entire whole, you see. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The gestalt that runs out of a series of elements or components, and the ultimate meaning that unfolds from the totality of those components is always greater than those components. So what we're interested now is in a totality. What's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal, Olam Haba. Olam Haba, the future life, future existence, deeply mysterious. No eye has ever seen it. No eye can begin to comprehend what it's about. Why can you not begin to comprehend what it's about? It's not because it doesn't exist, nor is it because it hasn't appeared yet. Its parameters are so different than anything you've ever been accustomed to. It is impossible to truly understand it in its way, but with enough shurim, the truth is you can get a decent grasp of some of its critical parameters. But that goes into a more advanced idea, outlook. But this is a state of existence. It is a state of being which does not exist now, which nobody is in now, not us, not the heavens, not the malachim. No one is in this state called Olam Haba. It is a state of being which will come after this state of being called Olam Hazeh is terminated. The critical difference between this state of being called Olam Hazeh and that state of being called Olam Haba is one that relates to dynamic versus static being. Our existence is dynamic, means that we are capable of change. We exist in a mode where we can exist from one moment to another differently. We can literally shift in existence from one moment to another. Meaning that the way you exist now is not necessarily the way you will exist 5 minutes from now. You may think it is, but it is not. Because if within those 5 minutes you had done a mitzvah, you are no longer the same person. Existentially, you have moved, and you have moved up, even though it may not be recognizable or discernible, but you have moved up. Therefore, we live in an existence which shifts from moment to moment, where you are literally a different person, moment to moment. In Olam Haba, when that state of being arrives, and will not arrive for another 253 years, 6,000. Well, even then, even though it arrives in 253 years, that's when it starts. It doesn't consummate itself until the beginning of the 10,000th year. So it's like 4,000 years in its evolution. But we'll get into that much later on, why you need the 4,000 years and what each one is about. The point is that that state of being is a world of constancy. Nobody goes anywhere, and I'm not talking about in terms of destination. No one goes anywhere in terms of existence. The moment that this world stops as soon as the Baruch Shalom rings the bell and says it's all over, right? Which is called Yom Adin, right? Or the moment that bell plays, that you can hear that bell and you can hear it all over the world, right? You will never, ever grow again. Sad, but true. You will stop. You will be fixed at the point in which you are, and you will not be able to move ahead. And that will become your destiny. That destiny is called Olam Haba. Because in that world, in that plane of existence, in that reality, there is no movement. There is only constant, fixed existential states. Olam Haba has a structure to it. It has a structure. It is a rule. It is a plane of existence that has a certain type of structure. To contrast to that structure, one man was created who had the ability to create that entire structure. That man was Adam Rishon. With that one neshama, he had the ability to create that entire structure of the world called Olam Haba. In order for him to do it, however, now it's very critical. We will repeat this idea many times on many, many deeper levels. And when we get to Pesach, when I get to the Pesach share, you'll see how important that becomes. There is a concomitant variation between these two all the time. Adam Rishon, the Neshama of Adam Rishon, the Guf of Adam Rishon, is in direct contrast to the structure of Olam Haba. Change Adam Rishon, you change Olam Haba. How does Adam Rishon get to Olam Haba? Step number one, through various different events in his life. All the events in a person's life can be essentially be subsumed under one of three different reasons. There are some minor reasons and there are certain exceptions to the rules, but these are the general principles. Whatever happens to you in this life will happen to you because of one of three reasons, and only one of three reasons. But it's not easy to figure out which one. Number one, the first reason, Nisayon. The word Nisayon in Hebrew means test or trial. Essentially what they are, these are all the events in your life which you will experience to allow you the opportunity to choose. And as you choose, you create or destroy Olam Haba, according to the law of justice. Those are the events in your life that relate to Nisayon. You see, or test, is the English word, test. Okay? Adam Rishon was given a test. Don't eat Neit Hadas Tova raw. Don't do it. That was his test. Okay? That was the deed which was Adam Rishon's opportunity in either to create or to annihilate Olam Haba. Hence, either to create or annihilate himself. That was the deed. Adam failed. The justice demanded annihilation. What did the Baruch Shem do? What did the reconciliation component of God's will do to the demands of justice? He externalized the evil deed so that it was no longer a statement of Adam Rishon himself in terms of his existence. It was no longer a description of the existence of Adam Rishon and would therefore have to be annihilated. Rather, it was externalized, meaning that it became something external to him, attached to him like a parasite, so that evil existed as an entity for the first time, which was attached to him. The reason, so that Adam Rishon could survive, so that he could survive and enter still into Olam Haba in a perfected way. But how would he survive? He would have to suffer. He would have to undergo pain. Because what happens is, as the evil is externalized and becomes attached to him, it then begins to what? Affect Adam. It's a parasitic element, it's called Zohamah, and it begins to feed on Adam Rishon in the ways that it does. And with Adam Rishon, it fed on him because he had to die, and a lot of other things. Many things happened with Adam Rishon, you see. And those punishments were the way the evil fed on him. rather than the evil destroying him, it simply fed on him, it affected him from the outside. But that's the catch. As it affected other missions from the outside, it annihilated itself. And that's the whole thing. While evil lies within you, it will annihilate you. But once it's taken outside of you, and it begins to act, then it annihilates itself. And as it does what it has to do, one day it disappears. And that's what it is. This, therefore, the events that happened to other Rishon, which caused them suffering and pain, had nothing to do with what? With the events that had to do with opportunities to choose. Because other Rishon was no longer concerned with that objective. He failed that objective. Which means that the events which transpired in the life of other Rishon would now be concerned with the acquisition of perfection. He would have to remove the evil thing in him so that he can perfect himself for Olam Haba. And these were, of course, the objective of Shleimus, or perfection. What allowed God to externalize the evil in Adam when the demand of justice said, no way? How did the Rebbeinu do it? And the bigger question is, there were no tzaddikim around but Adam Rishon. That's what all you sharp people are thinking. That's what the smart ones among you are thinking. Wait a minute. Everything we said last week was cute, but what does this have to do with Adam Rishon? He was the only one around. So what does it have to do with him, right? But since I did my homework, I'm still able to stay one step ahead of you. Okay? And the truth of the matter is, there are two critical concepts here, which I didn't mention last week, which are very important here. The critical mechanism of Kiyum to allow Adam Rishon to be saved, so that Hanagas HaYichud can reconcile his act, his destructive act of free will, and the will of God, was the descent of the Shekhinah into, or the loss of its ability to project its light. What God did, essentially, what they say in the vernacular, is that the Shekhinah descended into the Klippas. Or another way to say it, the Shekhinah went into exile. What does that mean? That means that the power which emanates from God, which is not God himself, it is something which is created. It is that power which represents him in this world. It is not him, because he transcends the existence of this world. But the power which reflects his power in this world, the light, the awesome light, which represents him, is called the Shekhinah. And it's called Shekhinah because it comes from the word shachen, to dwell or to reside. And we call it the Shekhinah because it's the power which we connect to. It's the way that he resides in this world, the way he's reflected in this world, even though it's not him. He, in his true essence, transcends all existence. But in the small portion of reflected power that he allows us to see, that is called the Shekhinah. That power was diminished, and its light was slowly darkened. Now, I won't go into the full ramifications of that process, but that is an enormously difficult process for that power, and it has enormous consequences for the whole concept of evil. But basically, it was the Shekhinah and the descent of the Shekhinah in its loss of certain of its powers, which allowed the externalization from the Neshama of Adam Rishon for him to survive. So in a sense, God in a certain sense diminished that light in which he revealed so that Adam would be able to survive. But there was another way that externalization took place. That's the way it was achieved, the mechanism of the diminishment of the Shekhinah. But what did it do? What did it do for Adam Rishon, and how did it allow him to survive? One, because he did have to sustain new things. He had to die, and there were many, many difficult things that had to happen in the world. He now had to work the fields. He had to work for his bread and so on. So the whole reality changed. But more fundamentally, the greatest manifestation of externalization on Adam Rishon was the fragmentation of Adam Rishon into mankind. The neshama of Adam Rishon was split and fragmented, so that each one of these pieces now became a different person. Who was Adam Rishon after he sinned? He was a totally different person. There was a remnant of him. But the Adam Rishon before he sinned and the Adam Rishon after he sinned were two different people. You see, he had a glimpse and a very distant memory of what he was and what he knew. Because before he sinned, Adam Rishon, well, just to give you an idea what he was, all of you have bodies and all of you have souls, right? Adam Rishon had a body and he had a soul, correct? The body of Adam Rishon, his body, I'm not talking about his soul, in that state, before he sinned, was equivalent in kedusha or impurity to your souls now. You catch that? His body, not a soul, was as great as your neshamas. You all consider your neshamas to be spiritual, and they are. It's very pure inside you, but it's totally spiritual. His body was on the level that your neshamas are now. Forget about what his neshama was on. After the sin, he lost that. And for the first time, both his neshama and his guf, his soul and body, descended into what we know as people that we are today. So it was not only descended in its level, but it also descended in terms of its composition. It became fragmented and fractionated, so that what evolved from Adam Rishon was mankind. And no longer would one man have the ability to either create or destroy Olam Haba. Now that will be the job of many men. So, if you look at the diagram, you see the concomitant variation. Okay? Olam Haba now is structurally fragmented. Why? Because mankind is structurally fragmented. So Olam Haba now needs the activity of many people to be developed. No longer the activity of one person to be developed. Do we see that? But the fundamental hanhagas remain the same. Just like Adam Rishon had to be tested, so does all mankind. So that each individual now must sustain his own type of test. Every person who has lived from the time of Adam Rishon until now has to undergo a certain kind of test so that he can build his part of Olam Haba, or the specific contribution that he makes. You see? You notice how the arrows are exactly correlated. Each person, what determines what chelik you have, what portion you have in Olam Haba? That depends on your relationship to the ultimate relationship of Adam Rishon. Where do you fit into the super soul of Adam Rishon? Where do you fit into this one arrow? These four arrows of mankind now represent the one arrow of Adam Rishon. So structurally, one became four. But those four originally fit into that one. And in some way, these four have retained their own portions, individually, you see. But in an exact parallel the way it was in Adam Rishon, except that now it's differentiated, whereas before it was unified. So that every person now who exists after Adam Rishon now exists individually with a specific contribution to make, depending on what the shirish or root of your neshama was. That's number one. So therefore the test of each person will be this different. No two people who lived from the time of Adam Rishon till now will ever have the exact same test, because it's not possible. God is not redundant. So two neshamas do not do the same thing, since each neshama in some way is connected to a different aspect of Olam Haba. But each one must undergo a process of test or assignment. So there are many, many events in our lives which will reflect opportunities to choose. We also choose correctly, we also choose wrongly. So therefore, we also have to undergo activities which will allow us to what? To be saved. So God must externalize the evil that we do, at least to the ones of us that are worthy of it, because we, as we said, God in certain cases, in the case of very wicked people, externalizes the good. But in general, what God does is externalize the evil so that people can allow to remain in the ultimate destiny. So what the Banishim does is then externalize the evil for many people and allow that evil to consume itself. But it does so through Yisun or punishment. If you don't do tshuva, if you do tshuva, you will externalize the evil yourself and dissipate it. If you don't do tshuva, if you are not concerned about what you've done, then the Banishim will externalize it and consume it against your will. And if you have to do that, it's going to hurt. So again, There are certain parts of life which will be concerned with shlemus, the externalization of evil, and the perfection of a person so that he can enter Olam Haba without any demands for non-existence from within him, so that he's pure, so that all he has are the results of his good deeds, which allow him to exist. But the question is, now, how does the Baruch Shem establish the notion of externalization? Now it's a different story. It's done two ways. One, it's still done by the Shekhinah. It's still done. In fact, the most greatest descent that has ever experienced in the Shekhinah is by the destruction of the first temple. Because when God destroyed the first and second temple, especially the first, the Shekhinah at that moment went into an incredible descent, and the light that it had completely darkened. You see. Now you may say, well, what does that do to me? What do I care if the Shekhinah darkens? How does that affect me? Well, the one instant effect that it has, if you listen to the Hanukkah tape, is exactly what transpired. Because before the destruction of the first temple, men were capable of being prophets. Men had direct access to spirituality. Men knew how to directly connect with the powers in the heavens itself, supernaturally, and draw down the cosmic forces so that they would know literally what is in God's plan and what is involved in the worlds of Kedusha and holiness. And they knew it by direct access. You see. After that time, it was lost. So that the ability to access spirituality was lost. What was retained? Something new in the world. The acquisition of truth would no longer be gotten through the vehicle of prophecy, but rather through the vehicle of wisdom or knowledge. Hence science came into the world. And just to repeat the phrase, we think that man, primitive man, the way we use the term, before the first place Amiris was primitive because he used to worship idols, he used to be into astrology, he was into the stars, and he was not concerned with observing phenomena as such. He seemed to be concerned with very simple, primitive types of situations. That's not true. Men before the destruction of the first temple, that idol worship they did was nothing more than the literal ability for them to draw down enormously powerful cosmic forces. They knew the rules of spirituality. They knew the rules of physics behind physics. They weren't concerned with the law of gravity because they understood the spiritual powers which made it work. That's what they had. You see, that was their true power. And we're not only talking about the Jews, we're talking about the Goyim as well. But after the destruction of the first temple, the Shekhinah darkened. When the Shekhinah darkens, the human being darkens, and its capacity to sense, to contact ruchnius, or spirituality, becomes incredibly diminished. So now, we can barely understand God through His physical world, but we are condemned to the physical. It sounds funny. The fact that we are entrapped in a world of science and technology is an imprisonment and a condemnation. It is the lowest level of mankind. It's very hard for us to believe. How could you say that in the 20th century modern man is condemned to the lowest level of insight? Because that's really what it was. Men before the first temple had no need for physics or science. Why? Because they were into metaphysics. That was beyond and into supernatural. And they had real powers in that way. It's only men after the destruction of the first temple that became consumed with that. They became consumed with what's called knowledge, or the observation of external events. But that's a drop. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care to what degree. I don't care if you can figure out the structure of the molecular structure of a DNA molecule. It doesn't interest me that you understand some of the basic laws of gravity because of the general theory of relativity. I don't care that you can try and explain certain atomic phenomena through the theory of quarks or strings or whatever have you. These are diminished levels of information. Diminished, very small levels. If you had the choice, you see, would you rather have to get into a car and turn on the ignition and drive the car from one place to another? Or would you rather some way have the ability to call down the spiritual force and teleport yourself from one place to another? Which one would you really rather have? Which understanding would you rather have? Well, if you ask the auto mechanics, they'll give you the clear answer. They'd much rather use cars. But the truth of the matter is that with certain types of knowledge, these things are possible. No longer. Man has retained vestiges of this information. Current day astrologers and current day people who involve themselves in these chokhmas only have distant rumors of what those things once were. You see. How do we know that these people those times have that type of wisdom? We know it many ways. And one of the obvious ways is very simple. Because when Moshe came and he went into Mitzrayim and the first plague, he turned the Nile into blood. Real blood. Astounding. When the Egyptians saw that, they looked at him and said, so what? Big deal. We can also do that. But after start, what do you mean you can also do that? Wasn't Moshe using the power of God? Yes and no. It was the power of God. But it was not a power that wasn't given to other men. Other men had it as well. You see. What the purpose of using that by Moshe will be to answer another question. But the point is that the ancient Egyptians knew full well how to do this themselves. And they were not really impressed. Well, if you have a state of mankind who has this ability, you see, you can see the descent. But why did the Baruch Hashem do that? Why did he diminish his Shekhinah? Why did it descend? So that he can externalize. That's the price of externalization. That is the greatest price of externalization. The loss of light, the loss of contact, the loss of access. That's the price that we pay. That's the bill that is put down on our table every time we eat a tray for meal. That's the bill. Loss of light. But the other mechanism that the Baruch Hashem uses is taking advantage of this network. Because now there's a network. There are many people. This person became a tzaddik gamar, a complete tzaddik. That person then becomes distinguished from all other people. Because not only is he connected to his olam haba here, but because of the fact that he's perfected himself in such a way, he is now used as part of the mechanism of another yichud for the purpose of kiyum or survival. Suffering is given to him, which he does not deserve or should not experience. He is a tzaddik. He has nothing to do with suffering because he has done nothing wrong. Yet this person must suffer. He must suffer. But to him it is not a purification because he has nothing to be purified from. He must suffer. Why? For him it is an avoda, it is a spiritual task. But he must suffer so that the rest of these people can live and survive. Because of the intricate way that he's connected with everyone. You see, the Yisuin that he takes on, and that's why it's called Yisuin Shel Ava, suffering from love. Because when God causes him to suffer, it is purely from the love of mankind. And when the tzaddik bears that suffering, it is because of the love of God. That's why it's called Yisuin Shel Ava. It is not Yisuin Shel Din, or justice. It is a suffering from love. When he bears that suffering, he becomes part of the mechanism which allows the rest of these people to survive, and so that their evil deeds are externalized. That's what it is. And the way that he allows it depends on his interconnection of the network. Which tzaddik is picked, and the way that tzaddik is picked depends on the network, on the structure of that network. You see. So that God knows exactly who to go to, for what amount and for what intensity, and for who. No one in this room knows who is suffering for who in this room. Nobody knows. You have no idea who on this planet is taking part of your load. Not so that you will be exonerated. No. Nobody's going to exonerate from the evil that anyone has done, but so that you can continue to survive, so that your evil deeds can be externalized, and you can go on. So God simply can merely punish you without destroying you. What tzaddik is bearing it now? No one knows. But we do know to some extent. We do know to some extent the greatest tzaddikim who are bearing it. And the one tzaddik who is chosen, to bear that suffering from generation to generation, he is the one tzaddik who is the most associated with this type of suffering, called Yisurim Shel Ahava. There are really three of them. There are three tzaddikim, three of the greatest tzaddikim, who essentially have been given the task of bearing the essential mechanism which will allow mankind to survive. Who are these three? Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mashiach ben David, and the Mashiach ben Yosef. Those three. And the one who feels it most poignantly between the three of them is the Mashiach ben Yosef. We will not go into the details of this, because the details of the relationship of Moshe Rabbeinu and the two Messiahs, called in Hebrew the famous term which you must learn, the Trei Mashiachim. Trei means two, the two Messiahs. That's what it's called, the Trei Mashiachim, the two Messiahs. Moshe and the Trei Mashiachim, this triumvirate bear the essential suffering of mankind. To understand the real mechanism of how they relate to mankind and why is the subject of a whole new series of shurim. After we finish about all the nations of the world, we are then in a position to go to another probably 14, 20 shurim that have to do with this alone. And by the time we're finished, you should have a very deep understanding of who the Mashiach is and what he's involved in, the nature of his personality, and the nature of that suffering, and many, many things about that. Why the difference between the two Mashiachim, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, which he actually once discussed. But we will go into that much greater depth. But I'd just like to go into two aspects of that now to give you some kind of feel for what it is. First, Moshe Rabbeinu. At the end of the Torah, we find the last chapter of the life of Moshe Rabbeinu. What happened at the end? What happens at the end is that he begs the Bonasham and davens over 500 tefillos to go into Israel. That's what he says. He begs the Bonasham to go into the land of Israel. After 40 years, when the Jews finally go out of the desert of Sinai and they're about to enter Israel, Moshe is sitting there praying to God. Now what happened was, at the sin of the golden calf, you see, at the sin of the golden calf, the Bonasham wanted to destroy the people of Israel, the children of Israel at that time, the Jews, because of what they did. Moshe begged the Bonasham, who was in a scholarly praise to him, and he succeeded in shifting, in creating a new type of ratio that never existed in Hanhagas. He shifted the Hanhagas HaMishpat and Hanhagas HaYichud in a new way, so that suddenly the aspect of Yichud, or externalization, became much more powerful. We will not go into the actual mechanism of that. That's a very, very deep thing what he did. I think we discussed a little bit of it, because he switched the whole nature of the Torah itself. But in essence, the Bonasham listened to him, and what the Bonasham said, okay, I swear, you see, that I will not destroy the Jews. He was able to get a shvuah, an oath from God, that God would not destroy the Jews at the sin of the golden calf. He succeeded in doing that. That oath that the Bonasham took was a new covenant. It was a new relationship between God and Israel that never existed before. It was a new relationship between the Bonasham and the Jews that had never existed since before the time of Adam Rishon. Because as I said before, and I will briefly say again, when the Jews left Egypt, it was the intention of God that they should enter into the land of Israel and start the Messianic period. The Jews who left Egypt were the Jews who were supposed to have been part of the Messianic period. There was never any intention for those Jews to go on into further generations. The world should have stopped then. The sin of the golden calf attempted to destroy that. So when Moshe Rabbeinu prayed to God, God said, I will allow them to exist, but the ability of them to bring in this perfect state of mankind called the Messianic period will no longer be true. No longer. And because of that, you, Moshe Rabbeinu, are no longer the Messiah. Which tells us, essentially, that Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach in his generation. And when the Rebbeinu Shalom said to Moshe Rabbeinu, go down from the mountain. Go down from the mountain. Lech rei, get thee down. He wasn't saying really to go down from the mountain physically. He was saying go down from your level because you are no longer Mashiach. Why? Because your people are no longer worthy of the Messianic light. And in order to do that, something happened which never happened before. Because when the Torah was given to Moshe, to the Jews at that time, that Torah was the Messianic light. That was it. What is the power of the Messianic light? The power of the Messianic light is a light which will allow you to suddenly understand every activity and event in history and the reason why it occurred. Call that wisdom. That is the wisdom that everyone is after. Why is all this stuff happening? That's what that Messianic light is about. It allows you to see from one end of the world to the other. Not physically, but conceptually. It allows you to understand everything which happened in your life for the first time in perfect order. Just like you understand a mechanism, perhaps a car or a radio or whatever you understand clearly, just like an engineer understands exactly how to design an electrical device, you will understand the structure and the construction of human history with the same precision. The science of providence is the Messianic light, but it is a light which is concealed, and that light should have been revealed to mankind, to Moshe at the first time. And when the Jews lost it because of the sin of the golden calf, they lost that light. And when they lost that light, they should never have the Torah, because the Torah at that time and the Messianic light were the same thing. So when Moshe begged the Rebbeinu Shalom to save the Jews, in essence what he was saying is this: give us a new light. Allow the Torah to exist in non-Messianic form. That is what Moshe achieved, which had never been done before. What Moshe did was strip the light of the Mashiach from the light of the Torah. Almost an absurd, impossible task, because the two are almost identical. But that's what he did. He stripped the two, and he said, let the Jews live with a Torah which is not Messianic, and take the essence of it, or the soul, up. So what the Rebbeinu did was take that Torah, which used to be one pure life, and suddenly convert it into a neshama and a guf, so that the Torah itself had a body and a life. Not physically, but metaphorically. And what the Rebbeinu did was strip the soul of the Torah and brought it up, and the body of the Torah, let him have it. But this was a new creation, because the Torah never had a body and never had a soul. It was one life, one pure life. But suddenly the Torah was in a dichotomous form. And what the Rebbeinu did was give Moshe the Torah in the form of a neshama and body. But the truth is, the Rebbeinu did not take the neshama up. What he did was he simply added a body to the Torah, guf, and he gave the whole thing to Moshe and said, here, have it. You no longer have the Torah in its soul form, so you no longer can see the Messianic light. You now have it surrounded in a guf, and you can only see the guf, the body. If you were able to learn the Torah, you open up the Chumash and you read it, what you are reading is the Messianic light surrounded by a body. The day that the Messiah appears is the day that he strips that body, and the light comes right out. You see, this is the power of the Mashiach. This is what Jews should have had at that time. But they failed to have it. So in order to what? In order to save them, Moshe prayed to God to alter an aspect of the Torah so that it would become non-Messianic. But that was an externalization. What Moshe did was to externalize the Torah. That's exactly what he did. He really externalized it. He begged the Rebbeinu to externalize it, so that it no longer, the Messianic light is no longer visible. And simply you can see it through its outer body, or through its external form. And the Baruch Hashem said, I swear to you that for the first time since creation, I will allow that light to be in an external form. But the Jews survived. When it came at the time of the death of Moshe, Moshe begged the Baruch Hashem to go into the land of Israel. He begged him. Why? Because Moshe knew that since he had the messianic power, if he entered Israel with the Jews, that would bring on the messianic age. He knew that. And the Baruch Hashem said, no, I cannot do that. So Moshe begged him and prayed and prayed. 515 tefillas he prayed to the Baruch Hashem to do it. And after 515, because that's the Gematria of Eschanon, the Baruch Hashem said to him, enough, no more prayers. It cannot be done. Or rather, it can be done. It can be done. You choose. I made a shvur, I swore and I took an oath that to allow the Jews to survive, I would externalize my Torah. You see, if you want to go into Israel, then I would have to undo that oath. You see, which would you rather have? You see, you choose. Would you rather me undo the oath that I took, that the Jews would have to live with an external Torah and survive in exile, or survive in the land of Israel but without the messianic light? Or would you rather have the fact that you will enter with them and what? So that the messianic light can go and force the annihilation of the Jews, but then you would have to build up a new nation. What do you want to do? So Moshe Rabbeinu says no. He said, allow it to remain the way it was. In other words, I desist from being Mashiach. And I desist from imploring that the messianic period stop now and let the Jews go into Israel to again renew their efforts to bring in this perfect messianic light. And as for me, the Baruch Hashem says, you must die in the land of Moab, outside. Why? Why must Moshe Rabbeinu die? Moshe Rabbeinu is not buried in the land of Israel. He is buried outside. Why? Because what the Baruch Hashem was saying is that you must recognize the ultimate price for your prayer. I externalized the Torah. True. I saved the nation. True. I did something to that messianic light I have never done before. But do you know what the bill was? Do you know who the tzaddik is? That is part of the mechanism which allows that externalization to take place? You. You're the one. And therefore you could never be buried in the land of Israel. You have to be buried outside in the land of the Goyim. Because by being buried outside, you must what? Descend into an area of great darkness for your neshama, and you must bear the burden to allow that survival to continue. So from that we understand that it is Moshe Rabbeinu, you see, who is the critical mechanism that allows the Jews from that generation, the generation of Egypt, to survive. And what about everyone else? What about all the people since that time? Well, at that time, the Baruch Hashem, when he destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash, which was a terrible, terrible thing, the Baruch Hashem went over and approached the neshama of the Mashiach himself. And the real neshama of the Mashiach. There are two parts of the Mashiach. There's the Mashiach when he lives as a human being, and then there's a crown, the light itself, which comes down on him and makes him to be Mashiach. In every generation there are two people who are vessels for that messianic light. Two people and only two people who have the neshamas that are capable of becoming vessels for that light. But if they don't have that light, they will not be Mashiach. And they will simply live out their days in whatever the way they do. You see. But the Baruch Hashem approached the light itself, or the neshama, in which was manifest in that light, which was an awesome neshama, because that neshama has never descended on the face of the earth. Had Adam not done his sin, Adam would have brought down that soul. It would have crowned him on its head, and he would have become the Mashiach. But since he failed, that soul remains on high. It is the most powerful neshama that has ever been created. Because it's even much greater than the neshama of Adam Rishon before he sinned. Much greater than him. And that neshama has never come down at all. So the Baruch Hashem approached that neshama and said, I need an incredible neshama to continue that mechanism. You see. So the Mashiach jumped and he said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, he says, if you need me, I take me. I volunteer. That's what he said. So he said, but on one condition, that I sustain the difficulty of all the Jews for all time. You see. And in essence, I will be able to ultimately extricate them, you see, from the evil of their own deeds and allow externalization to take place on the entire mass. So the Rebbeinu Shalom said, yes, this is the time of the destruction of the first temple. There's a medrash on this, very famous medrash. And then suddenly the Mashiach stood there, and very great angels, this is metaphorical, came and suddenly took an incredible yoke, an enormous yoke. I mean, it's all metaphor, because this goes in a spiritual thing, and suddenly took that neshama and bound that neshama in an incredible prison. An incredible prison. The nature of this and so on is something which we have to discuss much further later. But it was enormously painful, so that neshama of the Mashiach suddenly screamed out and says, what is going on? What is this? What is this monstrous prison? It suddenly realized, the neshama realized full well the implications of what it's just done. But the moral of the story is not don't volunteer. That's not the moral of the story. Because there was an absolute necessity for this. And the neshama of the Mashiach said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, am I not a creation? Do I have the power of God? And if I'm a human being, am I not of flesh and blood? If I live in a human being? And in the spiritual sense, am I not what? Just another created object? How can I sustain this prison for the thousands of years that lie in the future? So the Rebbeinu Shalom says, enough. I will descend with you. And what he meant was not himself, but the Shekhinah. And both the Shekhinah and the Neshama of the Mashiach both descended into the depths of the abyss to allow the externalization process to go on, so that the Jews can sustain the next thousands and thousands of years of exile, or whatever it takes to keep them going and to allow them to exist, no matter what kind of annihilative acts they do. So from this we see the awesome powers of this mechanism, the incredible powers of this mechanism, and that in every generation there are a select number of tzaddikim, very great men, who are connected to this aspect of the two Mashiachim. They're connected to it. And in that connection, they sustain small pieces of it, you see, so that the Jews are allowed to continue in whatever they have to in order to keep themselves going. The whole section of the Medrash there on the conversation between the Rebbeinu Shalom and the Mashiach ben Yosef. I mean, it's awesome stuff on this conversation, because the Mashiach ben Yosef is called Ephraim. That's his name. Haben Yakil Ephraim. Ephraim is always the Mashiach ben Yosef. And what it is there is another interesting part of the Medrash that says that the Satan, or the Satan himself, the full force of the evil that God created, the Satan himself once came up to the Rebbeinu Shalom and said, excuse me, this light that you have underneath your throne, what is that light? What is this light that you have? So the Rebbeinu Shalom said, this is the light of the Mashiach ben Yosef. So he said, can I see a little bit of it? Can I just look at what that is? Because it was hidden from the Satan. So he said, can I just look at a little bit of that light? So the Rebbeinu Shalom says, okay. So what the Rebbeinu Shalom did was just reveal a drop of it. As soon as a slight ray came out of that light, of that neshama, the Satan and the entire kingdom, the whole structure of the evil forces in the world suddenly shook in, like totally, like an earthquake, like 20 on the Richter scale. And the Satan like had such a chalisha, he like stepped back in staggering things, and he understood at that moment his ultimate demise, because he saw the ultimate weapon that would destroy him. Because the light is so enormous, it is so powerful, that it is not possible for the slightest shred of illusion or deception to exist in the human mind. Once that light is revealed, everyone in the entire world, and surely everyone in this room, will have an absolute certain awareness of the existence and constant presence of God without the slightest doubt. Now that is a very, very high level. There is no man who is ever able to achieve that. No man since the day of creation has ever been able to go to mankind and convince all of mankind of the existence and power of God. No one. Because that light is hidden. There is only one man who will have that power, and that's Mashiach. You see. In this case, the Mashiach ben Yosef, who will actually introduce that power. But that light is so enormous that when you see it, there is not a doubt in your mind in terms of who you are, what your origin is, and what the inner core of all existence is. It is instantly evident as soon as you see that koyach, that power. And that's the power that we're talking about. And these are the forces that are involved in saving mankind on a continuous basis. That's what it is. It is the constant diminishment of these lights, you see, and the pain that tremendous tzaddikim have to go through, that bear that suffering, you see, so that externalization can constantly take place. Survival through the diminishment of the Shina, the diminishment of the messianic light, and the constant involvement of great tzaddikim in suffering process, so that this can take place. Structurally, however, you'll see that mankind is identical to the first man. If you'll notice, the same mechanisms, the same events. Because every event which happens to you in your life will only happen because of one of these three things. Whether it is to Adam Rishon or to anyone else. So good and evil that happens to you will happen to you because it's a trial, or because it's an attempt to externalize in some way, save you, or it's coming on to you because you are needed for the mechanism of saving someone else. And that's how it functions. Next week, we will go into the last section of this area of justice, the concept of justice, and the way God's providence moves the world, and we will discuss a very critical topic called internal necessity, in terms of a very important understanding of how the mechanism really works in the entire arrangement of the affairs. How does it actually work? How does it really come down? What are the systems that generate it and sustain this mechanism? I mean, all this stuff. What's the machine behind this entire thing? And we'd like to go into some aspect to understand some of the critical ideas of that system which pervades all these things. But tonight, we see the overview. You see, we've taken quite a while, we've discussed each one of these things in great detail, at great length. But tonight we see the whole overview and how the entire thing is connected. This is important. Even the tzaddik, who is undergoing the Yisurin Shel Ava, who is part of the mechanism to help others, many times himself does not know, or he's not clearly aware of. And as we've said last week, the reason is because in order for that mechanism to function, he has to have done something wrong, at least minutely. Because when he does something minutely, suddenly he gets a sledgehammer. Now obviously the sledgehammer of troubles that are coming on him has nothing to do with what he just did, in terms of what? Proportional intensity. So he has some kind of idea that there's something else going on here. But all the specific ways that it actually happens is very difficult to know. So that any one individual many times does not know. If you're a very great tzaddik, they do know. Many of the great ones do know. Obviously, if you're on the level to start getting some of the stuff, you are also on the level to understand to a large degree also when it's beginning to come on you. But the exact iotas and the nuances and so on is not an easy thing to know, because these things constantly merge, you see. And they're so subtle that only the precise eye of God, so to speak, knows exactly, can discern which events adhere to which specific criteria, you see. The eye of God itself, meaning his infinite ability to discern the most subtlest nuances in existence.
Shekhinah went into exile or the Shekhinah diminished?
The same thing.
So it went into exile and it was diminished to whom it was intended for.
The
Okay,
same.
well...
Two different ways of saying the same thing.
Okay. And that's what Goyim did? In terms of Yaakov and Esau. Okay, but what happened when there was just Adam Harishon? Where did the Shekhinah go?
Also, it went into a klipa.
What is...
It diminished also.
Yeah,
so that in order for it to diminish, as it diminished, Adam diminished.
Yeah, but so it went somewhere else besides going into Adam Harishon.
It didn't go into Adam Rishon.
Right, it went somewhere else rather than go into Adam Harishon. It didn't diminish, it went somewhere else.
The Shekhinah doesn't go anywhere. It just gets small, it diminishes in its light, and its capacity to project its power diminishes. But it doesn't go anywhere. It's not a spatial thing. It's an existential affair. It's a condition. The diminishment of the Shekhinah, let's explain this. When we say the Shekhinah diminishes, it means that its condition is altered. That's what it means. When we say the Shekhinah went into Golus or into exile, that's only a metaphorical remark. What it means is that the Shekhinah now goes into a state or a condition which is alien to its proper performance. That's what it means. But the actual concept is that the Shekhinah is altered in its capacity to project or illuminate the incredible power of its Kedusha. That's what it means. It doesn't go anywhere, you see. Rather, it becomes something else, in the sense that it is diminished in its functional capacity, in terms of what it's supposed to do. And what the Shekhinah is supposed to do is project the light of the existence of God, and therefore to reveal the absolute existence and unity of God. That's what it's supposed to do. When it diminishes, it no longer has the capacity to do that. So what it produces is a world where the existence of God becomes hidden. That's really what's happening. Do we all catch this? The function of the Shekhinah, which is the power that emanates from God, His light, has the specific purpose of projecting the existence or the absolute unity of the Bnei Shalom. When you see the Shekhinah, in the sense that when you experience it, you know that God exists. Just like you see me. There's not a question in your mind whether I exist, or there shouldn't be a question. But, in the same sense, the ability of the Shekhinah to project that light means that you know that God exists. So that the yichud, the revelation of God's unity or His existence, is certain. When that light is diminished, and we say that light goes into exile, you see, what happens is that what appears in the world is a state where that existence is no longer definite. You see, where the existence or power of God is no longer obvious, and God recedes, so to speak. As the Shekhinah is dimmed, God's existence recedes. Not that He recedes, but the ability to see that, the ability to know that He is, and to know how He is in the way that He wants us to know, recedes. And we say that God hides. God says that in the end of days, I will hide myself. How does God hide? How does God hide? How does existence itself hide? That is the incredible trick. He hides. The mechanism is called the diminishment of the Shekhinah. So that what happens is that the power of His existence is no longer obvious. And as the power of His existence is no longer obvious, the deception of your own existence becomes more invigorated. The deception of your own existence. As God withdraws and hides, the illusion of your own power and your own independence becomes more and more strengthened, you see. But the diminishment of the Shekhinah is the diminution or the reduction of the revelation of His unity. What's called in the vernacular, very important, the open awareness or the clear understanding of the existence of God and His manifest power in all creation is called Gilui Yichud. And these are two words which you should memorize. Gilui means the revelation, Yichud means His unity, because it is His unity which you see, His power.
That's the direct result
of the
people.
that's the Torah. That's when the light comes down. When the Baruch Hashem is Magah, the revelation of Sinai is a revelation of Gili Yichud. When God took the Jews when the Baruch Hashem took the Jews out of Egypt, right? And suddenly he split the Red Sea, and he took one nation from another, and he destroyed Egypt. Everything supernatural. Was there any doubt about the existence of God? Was there any doubt about who ran the world? Was there any doubt that this world is a physical world run by supernatural power of God? Is there any doubt about it? When you see the Baruch Hashem suddenly stand up a sea in 12 rows and 12 tribes walk through it, is there any doubt who runs the world? Is there any doubt who runs the world when suddenly the world becomes pitch black at noon? And it's so black that you have to sit down because you can't even walk. That's how thick the darkness is. Is there any doubt who guides the world? Whose power runs the world? No. Is there any doubt when in one night every firstborn child of Egypt dies at the same hour without one physical sign? Is there any doubt about who really governs the world? No. That's a time of Gili Yichud. That's a time of the revelation of God's existence, or the revelation of His unity. But when God diminishes the Shekhinah, it is called Hester Yichud, the hiding or the concealment of His unity. Gili Yichud, the revelation of His unity. Hester Yichud, the concealment of that unity. But that's done through the contingencies or the changing conditions of the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is like a lamp. Okay? Like a lamp. Yes, it is a lamp. And the Shekhinah is the lamp of the world. And the Baruch Hashem has this thing on the rheostat. Okay? And when the lamp is at its brightest, there is no question in the entire world, among all men, of the power of God, His existence, and His control, and that all reality is dependent on Him. And when He closes the rheostat, He begins to turn it so that the light begins to dim and it becomes dark. That darkness is felt by the fact that the evidence of God's existence is no longer so evident and no longer so apparent. And in 1987, January 5th, 1987, the rheostat is almost complete. The switch is so close to being shut off that it's astounding. Because the truth is, where do you see God? Where? Walk outside. Where's God? Where? Do you see God among the nations of the world? No. Do you see God in the universities and the laboratories? No. Where is God? Where is God hiding? Where is He? How can a being of absolute existence disappear or hide? Where did He go? That's because, not that He went anywhere, but the light, the lamp, has been dimmed. And we relate to God through the lamp. We cannot know God as He is, because He transcends existence. He transcends our ability to know, but we can relate to Him through the lamp. And it's that lamp which is controlled. What controls that lamp? We do. We do. If we adhere, if we look at the lamp, and we attempt to get close to that light, and we attempt to model our lives consistent with the light of that lamp, then that lamp gets stronger. It becomes brighter. If we keep the Torah, if we perform the mitzvahs, if we attempt to get close to God, to understand Him, that light gets stronger. The reward we have is that the light itself becomes stronger. If we go away from that light, if we attempt to go on our own, if we defy God, if we attempt to defy God, and we are evil to other men, then the light begins to diminish. And God begins to withdraw. But why does God withdraw? Because the ability to expand or decrease the light is the Hanogas HaYichud. Because in Hanogas HaMishpat, there is no such thing as a rheostat. It is an on and off switch. According to Din, it is an on and off switch. Means that the light shines, if you follow the light, you have it. If you don't, it is off. The light is gone. And when the light goes, you go. That's what justice is. Din or mishpat is the ability or the on or switch of that light. There's no variation in the oneness of God. There's no variation in God's presence in the world according to Din. Din doesn't understand this concept of variation. In Din, there's only in Mishpat and justice, there's only an on and off switch. That's all it is. Either you create eternity and you exist, or you annihilate yourself and you don't exist. There's no other, there's no possibilities. There's all the excluded middle. Between existence and non-existence, there is no third option. And there's no variations between existence and non-existence. They are absolute states. But in the attempt of God, or rather in the desire of God, there's no attempt, there's a desire, and there's the performance of God to reconcile His will with your free will. What the Banisham does is create the process called variation, where that light can go up or go down. And that light goes down to externalize and to allow you to survive. That's why the light goes down. What does the light going down have to do with externalization is the question that was asked before, you see. But suffice it to say at this time that these two are connected. That in order for us to continue to go on, the Shekhinah must be diminished. The light must slowly go off. How far can that light go down? How far? How far can we tease God to put that rheostat down? How far will God tolerate it going down? That's the question. Right? That's the question. And the final and ultimate mystery is this. What is that? And this is the most astounding thing of all. That as the light goes off and the rheostat goes off, this is the biggest surprise of all. But you can understand this perfectly from everything I said. What is that? That's the dial. That's the rheostat. Okay? That's the dial on the lamp called the Shekhinah. Okay? Starts at 1, or rather, it starts at 10, and it begins to go down. Okay? At 10 it's very bright. Admiration before the Chet. Very bright. Mistake number 1. It's at 9. Okay? There's the Hamabo. The flood, the destruction of the entire flood, it's down to 6. The golden calf, 4. The Churban Beis Hamikdash, 3. It keeps going down and down and down. We see it. We can almost itemize in history when it's going down. We can see the dial move. Now, January 5th, 1987, it's at 0.001. Okay? Nothing survives at 0.00. Nothing. Because that's absolute darkness. Total annihilation. That's what it is. How far could it go? Will it reach 0.00? Will it ever reach there? What do you think? The answer is it will. It most assuredly will. There's no question about it. Look where it's at now. If I would take Avram Avinu, or if I would take somebody who lived in the time of Yaakov and I would bring them here and sitting next to you, and you would compare yourself to him, you would take your head and hide it, you see, in a drawer. You would open up the trunk of your car and you would lock yourself in and you would never come out because you would be so embarrassed at about what you have become. Okay? That's essentially what it is. That's how embarrassed you would be at the descent of mankind. So, the problem is, if you have descended this much, what's to say you can't descend further? Yes, you can descend further. You most assuredly can, without question. Therefore, this dial definitely will hit 0, 0. Now, this is a red zone. The red lights go on, danger, and so on. And finally, what? No more gas. No more gas. like you know, the danger zone in a nuclear power plant. right? Meltdown, like 1 second away from meltdown, all the bells are going off, okay, zero. What happens at this point? That's the thing. What happens at this point? What do you think happens at this point? Technically what should happen is total annihilation. Because as I said before, the light cannot go away. The light is diminished. It's over. But the most strangest thing happens. The strangest thing happens. What is that? When that happens, you see, at the second it hits 0.0, suddenly the lamp bursts open in a total illumination. Totally. Now, does that mean that suddenly the light goes back on? No. The light doesn't go back on at all. It doesn't. That's what the light was all the time. It was always like that. What was covering the light was the screen. And what happens is that when the screen becomes so thick and so black that every ray of light is blacked out, the screen disappears and the Shekhinah is back. What am I talking about? Right? You're looking with this puzzled look. You see, you're all surprised at what I'm saying. But the truth of the matter is that surprises me. I'm surprised at you. What have I been talking about for the last month? What happens when evil is externalized? What happens? It consumes itself. So as the Shekhinah is being diminished, it's not that the Shekhinah is being actually diminished. There's no real diminution. It is what's called apparent diminution. You see. And as this is taking place, the filter is slowly being destroyed. So that when the filter is at its maximum position, it is suddenly dissipated. And the Shekhinah is back. That is the way God saves the world. In truth. That's what Kiyah means. That is Hanavat HaYichud. That is Hanavat HaYichud. And we will finish off with this one statement. All impurity, the greatest tumor that you see out there, the greatest perversion, the greatest evil that we see, the greatest darkness is only apparent. Total darkness is nothing more than the disguise or concealment of total light. Total cruelty is the concealment or the mask of total goodness. Total impurity is the mask for total purity. This is the mask of God. Evil, impurity, darkness. Those are the masks that the Shekhinah wears. But the Shekhinah only wears those masks. It is not identical to those masks, you see. And what happens is that those masks disappear. And as they disappear, the Shekhinah is again restored, or it is revealed in its complete, pristine glory. You see. And the last story is a story that I made up myself. It's a metaphor and kind of symbolizes the entire thing. And I think we should end here. It is the last conversation between the Sultan and God right before the Messianic time. Who would like to have the last conversation? Okay? This is the last discourse or the last judicial event that will take place right before the Messianic prophet. You want to hear how it goes?
Yeah.
This is how it goes. The Sultan runs up to the Baruch Hashem because the Sultan is the prosecuting attorney, runs the entire court and says to the Baruch Hashem, who's the Yoshev Rosh, the Dayan, the judge, not God himself, but the power of God. And the Sultan says to the Baruch Hashem, he sits there, and suddenly the Baruch Hashem confers, and he says, I decree that the Jews are worthy of redemption. Let them be redeemed, Tigoyel. Let them be redeemed. Let the Messiah come. So the Sultan hears wind of this through his cronies, and he runs up there and he says, what are you talking about? What do you mean the Jews should be redeemed? Are you talking about the same Jews that I know? Are we talking about the same people? So the Baruch Hashem says, yes. He says, where? What are you talking about? So the Baruch Hashem says, what's wrong with redeeming them? So the Sultan says, well, look at them. And so he opens up this glass window here, and he sees them all and says, look what they're doing. Look what they're doing down there. These are the people who talking about. So the Baruch Hashem reflectively looks and says, So the Rebbeinu looks and says, you're right, forget about that. A couple of weeks later, the Rebbeinu thinks again and says, Pigoy, let them be redeemed. And the Sultan says, wait a minute, didn't we have this conversation a couple of weeks ago? Again, he opens up the window and says, look, what are you talking about? And the Rebbeinu says, you're right, drop it. A couple of weeks later, the Sultan runs up to the Rebbeinu, or rather, the Rebbeinu announces, I am bringing the redemption. And the Sultan runs up and says, look, this has got to be the last time. This is impossible. And the Rebbeinu looks at him this time in a very serious look, and he says, why? So the Sultan says, because this is an evil people. So the Rebbeinu says, where? How do you know they're so evil? So he says, look. He opens up the window, and he opens up his empire, and he says, don't you see all the light that I have captured? Don't you see my domain? Don't you see how powerful I am? I am so powerful from the sins of the Jews. Can you not see it? So the Rebbeinu says, what power? Where is your power? So he says, let me show you. So the Sultan opens up the vault that contains the light of Israel, all the souls of Israel that were given to him by virtue of the sins. He opens up the vault and it is empty. And the Rebbeinu says, you have no power. And suddenly it is over and the redemption ensues.
Why is the vault empty?
The vault is empty because every evil deed has been externalized and it is dissipated on its own. But it has done so in the vault, out of the eyes of the Sultan. So the Sultan himself is totally unaware of what happened. So the last shout and scream is totally in vain, and the Jews commence the redemption itself.